Only when we find our identity in Jesus Christ will we have a successful life as a husband, as a father, as a ministry leader, as a pastor, as you know, fill in the blank. Understanding your identity in Christ first, it will permeate everything else.
This is your nautical lantern on the dangerous seas of darkness. Let's push off from the placid shore of the status quo and explore what's beyond the horizon. I am your host, BT, and this is Truth and Shadow, your podcast of the supernatural. In today's culture, masculinity is often portrayed as toxic, oppressive, or outdated. But when we look to the Bible, we see a very different picture. A call to a form of masculinity that is not only vital, but also transformative. We're living in a time where the concept of what it means to be a man has been distorted, leaving many men without a clear understanding of their roles or responsibilities. The confusion surrounding masculinity has led to a crisis in our culture, a crisis that only a return to biblical principles can resolve. Today, we see a very different picture of masculinity in our culture. Movements that dismiss traditional masculinity have left many feeling lost, unsure of their purpose or place. The rise of fatherlessness, for example, has had devastating effects on our society. Studies show that children from fatherless homes are more likely to face issues like crime, poverty, and academic failure. The absence of a strong, godly male figure has created a vacuum that has been filled with confusion, brokenness, and instability. In many ways, our culture has traded the biblical model of masculinity, one of strength, leadership, and responsibility, for a counterfeit that is either passive or domineering. Neither of these extremes reflect the true essence of what it means to be a man according to God's design. So what's the answer? Well, it's a return to biblical masculinity. It's a call to rise to the challenge of embodying the traits we find in Scripture: courage, integrity, self-discipline, and humility. Real biblical masculinity isn't about dominance. It's about leading with humility. Like it says in Ephesians 5:25, how we are given a powerful example of what it means to be a godly husband. For husbands, this means love your wives just as Christ loved the church. He gave up his life for her. Here we see that biblical masculinity involves sacrificial love and servant leadership. A man is called to love selflessly, to lead not with an iron fist, but with a servant's heart. We need men who are willing to stand up for what is right, to lead their families with love and conviction, and to influence their communities with integrity and grace. True leadership in a biblical sense means serving others, prioritizing their well-being over personal gain. It means laying down our lives, our desires, and our pride for the sake of those we are called to lead. How can we live this out? Here are a couple of practical steps. First, commit to a daily devotion and to prayer. A man who is in constant communion with God, who allows the Word to shape his character, is a man who will lead well. Second, seek accountability. Find a trusted friend, a mentor, a small group of men where you can be encouraged and challenged to grow in your faith and responsibilities as a man. Lastly, invest in mentorship. If you're an older man, mentor a younger man. Pass on your wisdom, your experience, and provide guidance. And if you're a younger man, seek out a mentor, someone who can help you navigate the challenges of life with godly wisdom. Now more than ever, our culture needs men who are willing to stand up and live out their God-given roles with courage and conviction. Let's reclaim what it means to be a man, not as the world defines it, but as God intended. When men embrace their biblical calling, they become the foundation of strong families, vibrant communities, and a stable society. The impact of biblical masculinity extends far beyond the individual. It's a force that can change the world. Are you ready to be the change? In a world where the lines between good and evil often blur, our guest seeks to reveal the truth about the essence of biblical masculinity. He is a beacon of wisdom in these tumultuous times. He delves deep into the reality of the timeless virtues that define a true man of faith. Today we are talking about being a biblical man and the spiritual soldier of our house. Join us as we navigate through the shadows of doubt, the truth of divine guidance. He is the faithful guardian, gospel gladiator, heavenly herald. Anthony, welcome to the show.
Thanks, BT. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on this podcast. I'm excited about our conversation.
Absolutely, me too. After reading your book, Framework for Biblical Masculinity, which is kind of the base of what our show is going to be about today, I'm pretty excited to be able to talk to you. And for the audience, let's talk about you. Let's tell the audience who you are.
Yeah, so obviously, my name is Anthony Curnutt. I've been married for 21 years now, as a matter of fact, this month, and I'm a father of 6. I have a podcast of my own, Real Men Talk, that we've been doing for a few years. Author, Framework for Biblical Masculinity, and men's ministry leader. And, I do a plethora of other things that we won't get into, but that just keep you busy. So, all in all, I love ministry. I love Jesus. Everything that I do, I try to permeate Jesus throughout everything. Um, Raising my kids, my wife, my ministry, and I want to take, the whole basis behind our ministry is to build leaders and other men, that they can become godly leaders in their homes, communities, and churches.
I mean, this book right here, it's not a thick book, but I think, in all honesty, the weight of the information involved and the fact that you throw in these takeaways at the end of the chapter really help a reader not just absorb the information, but it feels like it's a way for us to incorporate, as men, this framework into our lives. And so, how does the Bible itself define masculinity?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question, and you're right. The book's not very thick. I wanted to make it all meat and potatoes. Whenever the publisher, when he come and asked me, he's like, "What's your vision for the book?" I told him, I said, "the I want when a man picks up this book, he goes, I can read that." That's what I wanted. I didn't want anything intimidating. I didn't want anything that was going to be overbearing. I didn't want a bunch of fluff. Um, I'm that's my type A personality coming out, but um, I like meat and potatoes stuff, and so getting down to the nitty gritty and just giving them the information that they need, because it's already heavy, kind of like what you said already. And so defining biblical masculinity, you know, first and foremost, we have to look at the life of Jesus. He's our supreme example of masculinity. You look at who Jesus was. Jesus was a servant. Um, and so, the first shall be last, the last will be first, kind of thing. We live in a culture where if you want to be a man, you have to have so much sex, or if you want to be a man, you have to lift so much weight, or if you want to be a man, you have to work so many hours. If you want to be a man, you have to be so tough, or if you want to be a man. And Jesus didn't define masculinity in any of that. You know, he defined masculinity in servanthood. How can you be a servant to your wife, and how can you be a servant to your children? How can you be a servant to your church and your community, and be a leader at the same time? Jesus was no pushover. He was, just as humble as he was also direct. He was a man that he didn't pull any punches. He was stern when he had to be. He was soft when he knew he was supposed to be. And so when you look at Jesus and the way masculinity is defined today, it's two completely polar opposites. I think of another example. I think of David. David was this warrior. This man who, good grief. I mean, David was a warrior of warriors. Him and his mighty men. They could, throw spears both hands. They were just unbelievable. We could talk about this. One of my favorite subjects. But anyways, but David also knew how to play a harp. He also knew how to repent before the Lord. When he messed up. These are the qualities that men need to have. Yes, we have to be protectors. Yes, we have to be providers. Yes, we have to be the man that God has called us to be. But at the same time, we have to know where we are. We have to find our identity inside of Jesus. And that's what David did. David, even though he was this macho man, he was this bad dude, his identity was still found in God. And he understood that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's so many biblical figures that we can look at and go, gosh, man, these are exemplars of masculinity. Whether that person's Joseph to Job to any of his apostles, really, at the end of their training with Jesus, so to speak. They go from boys to men when they are with Jesus. And one of the major things that I like to cover here on Truth and Shadow is the reality of spiritual warfare. And I wanted to get your impressions on how spiritual warfare affects men specifically differently than women.
Well, the culture in which we live is geared towards sexuality, which is, if any man is honest with himself, is our biggest downfall, right? Sex sells. You can't walk into Walmart. You can't walk in. You can't drive by billboards. You can't turn on a TV. You can't watch a commercial. You can't. Nowhere without it being in your face constantly. I was listening to a guy one time, and he was talking about Pastor Joe Dobbins. He's from St. Louis. He said, most men don't even think about what they think about, right? And so I tell my guys in my men's group all the time, think about what you think about. And that's real spiritual warfare. 2 Corinthians 10:4-5 talks about, bringing every thought underneath the captivity of Jesus Christ. And I'm paraphrasing. But that is it. That is spiritual warfare. And to where it is exhausting, right? Because we function different than women do, right? Obviously, women have got their own spiritual warfare. They've got their own, hang-ups, the things that they deal with, the things that I don't want to take anything away from them, but men deal with things differently. We strive to impress, we strive to be noticed, we strive to be all these different things on top of being driven by our sexual lusts. And I keep coming back to that because it is probably the biggest downfall for men today. And a lot of it's because of the culture in which we live. And the spiritual warfare. And here's the thing: to bring every thought underneath the captivity of Jesus Christ is absolutely exhausting. Anybody who has tried to do it for any amount of time knows that when you try to do this, it is overwhelming. It is exhausting, right? But we weren't meant to do it by ourselves, right? That's the reason why we have the Holy Spirit. That's the reason why we allow Jesus, sanctification to come in, to change us, to change our minds, to, change that old man and to bring in a new man, and so, and it's crucial. We as men have to understand the importance of spiritual warfare in our lives. Because if you don't realize that you are in spiritual warfare, you're already losing. That's just all there is to it, And I know that sounds really brass, but it's true. There is no neutral ground, right? You're either thriving or you're dying. And again, I know I'm kind of being rough, and I don't intentionally mean to be that way, but that's just the nature of what it is. And so, if you are taking a back seat in your spirituality, if you're allowing your wife to be the spiritual leader, if you are allowing other people to be the spiritual leaders of your homes, if you're allowing your kids to be the spiritual leaders of your homes, you are failing as a husband and a father and a leader, right? And I know I was talking to a guy one time. We were talking about. I had this conversation with this guy, and he was an atheist, and we were discussing, and we were talking about he kind of wanted to know my take on marriage and stuff, and so kind of the same thing I had given you a while ago. I was like, taking care of your wife, and all that good stuff. He's like, man, that sounds like a lot. He's like, I don't want that kind of responsibility. That is the problem with men today. We are scared to do hard things. Yes, marriage is tough. Yes, fatherhood is tough, right? There's no blueprint for any of this, right? We learn by our failures, right? My favorite quote is by Nelson Mandela: "I never take a loss, only a lesson." And because we fail a lot, right? Again, there's no blueprint for it. You can try your best, you can raise your kids in church, you can do all the everything that you know to do right, and you're still going to fail. You're still going to mess up somewhere. You're still going to create wounds, right? And so the goal is when you do fail, when you do mess up, you learn from it. And and all of that encompasses spiritual warfare.
I believe the home is the first domestic church, right? So when it's just man and then husband and wife, obviously that's the beginning of a domestic church, and then a child is brought into children is then brought into that house, so into that domestic church before they go off into, like you say, you don't let the public school system raise your children. You do that. You don't let your big church raise your children. You need to be the leader in raising your kids, because if they hear something wrong at church, you need to be able to say, no, this is what it says and this is what it means. And we have to be able to do that. And so what I want to ask on that is, first, how can men, right, protect themselves, and then when they get married, how can men protect themselves and then their family from spiritual attacks?
Man, that's such a good question. Accountability. I think that brothers in arms is probably the biggest thing that we can do to have. I don't want to say necessarily successful, but a thriving relationship with Jesus, especially when you're single. I know men that are up in their 30s and 40s that are single and living for Jesus, and and I'm gonna be real honest with you, I can't even imagine in the culture in which we live, doing that, but people do, and they're fantastic. But and I tell you why they're successful at it is because they surround themselves with other godly men that keep them accountable. Hey, men that you can trust. I am a big advocate for men's ministries. I think every church needs them. Every man needs a group of men that he can trust, that he can lean on, that when things are getting tough, I have men in my men's group that, hey, I've been struggling with pornography. Okay, so how can we help you overcome this? How can we get you on the other side of this? And they come to me because they want to be set free from it. They can't do it on their own, right? It's too accessible. It's too easy. It's too, Satan's got it everywhere. And so, the key to being successful is not doing it by yourself. When you're single, have a group of men. When you're married, have a group of men and your wife, right? You should be able to rely on your wife, but you also need a group of men, not to replace your wife, but because men understand what other men go through where women don't necessarily understand, right? There are things that you can discuss with other men that you are comfortable with that you would have a hard time discussing with your wife because she couldn't completely understand. Not that I'm saying that we should hide things from our wives or anything. That's not what I'm saying. But we need men in our lives. And I really think that is key. I mean, not even Jesus went through this life by himself, right? You see him you see him at the Mount of Transfiguration. He took 3 of his disciples with him. You see him in the garden. He took 3 of his disciples with him. He come back. He's like, could you not pray with me for just 1 hour? He didn't bring them along for educational purposes. He wanted them. He needed them in his time of need. If Jesus, our supreme example of masculinity, our supreme example of manhood, wanted and needed support in his time of need, how much more do we need a group of men that we can trust, that we can rely on?
Other men will hold you accountable in ways that your spouse is not equipped to do, right? Women don't have the tools that are actually necessary in this weird thing of being a man, right? It's harder for them to understand exactly what's going on, but men with their boys, they're quite capable of being held accountable.
Right. Well, and I think a lot of it is insecurities. If our wife comes at us and was like, hey, you screwed up today, right? It affects us different than one of our friends, from church that, one of our dudes be like, hey, bro, you've screwed up. You got to get this right? You're going to take that different. And that's just the nature of it. I don't want to say it's because there's a lack of trust inside the marriage, but you're always trying to perform for your wife. You want to be that spiritual leader, with other men that understand the weight of being a man, the weight of being a husband, the weight, what I mean? They're coming at you from an area of, hey, I understand you. And I understand that you're screwing up, and I'm trying to catch you before you go down a road that you don't need to. Where when our wives come, we accept it as an attack, and it may not always be that way, but a lot of times that's just the way that we take it.
One of the major dangers in a man's spiritual life is being passive, right? And when we bring this home to dealing with spiritual conflicts, because they could be many, they could be manifold, they could be anything. I mean, from any kind of addiction, and that does go to buying things too much, drinking too much, smoking too much, etc. Any of the things that are done in excess. When a man is passive in his household and he's not addressing the dangers of sin and the temptation of sin, it can cause some major issues. But how can we, as men, as biblically based masculine guys, be more balanced in our humility, our servant leadership, in this spiritual warfare at home?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. First, we need to understand the nature of passivity. We are told that, that we're supposed to be passive. Anymore, if you're a man, that you should really just shut up and not either that Either you're one of two things. You're either toxic, right? In today's culture, you're either toxic, or you're a good little boy that keeps his mouth shut, right? You're one or the other. And we have to understand what passivity is and the way that it affects us. Passivity will always bring about chaos. Let's go back to the Bible. Let's go back to the very beginning, right? Adam in the garden was passive. When you read the scriptures and it says Eve ate from the fruit and gave it to Adam, who was with her. Adam was there. Adam watched all of this unfold. Not only did he watch all of this unfold, there was a moment there when Eve ate of that fruit and Adam didn't. Adam had a choice to make. And instead of standing up for the word of God, standing up for what he knew was true that come from God, he was passive about it. He bowed down to his wife, ate of the fruit, and brought about chaos. Passivity will always bring about chaos. And we have to understand that, yes, it is hard. It is hard at times to be forthright, to operate in truth. Sometimes it's easier to tell the little white lie and be passive about it than it is to tell the truth. And obviously, we should always be cordial. We're Christians. We need to we need to do everything with love, but that doesn't mean that we stray away from truth. And passivity, I'm going to be real honest with you. Passivity has brought America where it is today. I'm a firm believer that the reason why America is in the shape that it is today is because the church has been passive for over a century, and we've sat back and we have allowed things to happen. And we've allowed things to go on, and we've kept our mouth shut in the name of love and being understanding, and we just want to preach the gospel. And I read a book one time called Letter to the American Church. He was talking about the Germans, and he was talking about how there was 18,000 pastors roughly in Germany at the time when Hitler came. He said there were 3,000 that were for Hitler. There were 3,000 that stood against Hitler, and there were 12,000 that just stood that was completely passive about it. 12,000 pastors. Look at what passivity brought about in Germany. If all of those pastors would have stood up and was like, hey, this is not right. If half of those pastors would have stood up and been like, hey, this is not right. Something is wrong here. We're going to stand up for truth. That is where America is going. And it is the church's fault. It is the men of the church's fault for not standing up for truth. Yeah. So to answer your question, how we can keep from being passive is to understand passivity and understand what it does to our culture, what it does to our families, and what it does to our churches. We have to understand. We have to understand that we are living in a time now that we don't have the luxury to be passive anymore.
When we look at the biblical text and we read the stories about Joseph or David, any of the massive leaders of masculinity, we can call them biblical masculinity. There's these principles within the text that honest men would be able to look at and apply them. Let's take a moment and just look at some of those principles for leading our lives, for men basically leading their lives spiritually.
Yeah. Oh man, there's so many. Yeah. All right. So let's start with Job, and I like Job because you see, Job was supposed to be the first book that was ever written. It's the oldest book of the Bible. And I think that was for a reason, because the way that you see Job, what I love about Job is he understood who he was according to God. But you also see him when he got in a hard time, he was like, God, where are you at? And we need to understand that life is not always easy. This walk of masculinity will never be easy. It will never be, cookie cutter. It will never be, all these times. And it's okay to come to God and be like, hey, where are you at? What is going on? And then when God answers, I love the way God answered Job. He was like, were you there when I created the stars? Were you there when the foundations of the earth was laid? And then Job was like, oh yeah, you're God. To set a foundation of masculinity, one, understanding who you are in Christ. Your identity will dictate who you are in the way that it will permeate everything. So if you see yourself as less than, if you see yourself as just a husband, if you see yourself as just a father, right? If your identity is wrapped up in your wife or your identity is wrapped up in your children, if you see yourself as just a pastor or you see yourself as just a church goer, right? So your identity is wrapped up in your church, it's wrapped up in your ministry, right? All that stuff plays a part too. It will permeate everything else, and failure will come only when we find our identity in Jesus Christ. Will we have a successful life? It doesn't mean that we're going to be. I'm not preaching prosperity or anything like that, right? We're not talking about that, but being successful in following Christ is the most important thing that you could do for any part of your life, as a husband, as a father, as a ministry leader, as a pastor, as fill in the blank. If you're a politician, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Following Christ first, understanding your identity in Christ first, it will permeate everything else. And then we look at Daniel. I think Daniel is such a great example of masculinity. You see Daniel being taken from, and probably most everybody understands the story behind Daniel, taken from his homeland. You see David stand up for what is right off the bat. He didn't choose to be there. The reason why he was there was a failure of his nation in the first place, as a whole. So here he is. He's serving a consequence that's not of his country. Let me put it that way. He's serving a consequence of his country. It wasn't necessarily his fault. You see the way he serves God, but his country failed, and because of that, they went into captivity. And so you see Daniel right off the bat being like, "Hey, I'm going to serve God," and God honoring him throughout his entire life. You see, between when he was in prison and the whenever they, at the very beginning, whenever they wanted to give him the food, he's like, I'm not going to eat that stuff. I'm going to eat this stuff, and of course the guy who was over him he was terrified, because if Daniel lost weight, or Daniel, wasn't strong enough, like he was dead, right? And Daniel's like, trust me, God's got this. And then you see one of my favorite things about Daniel. Not only did he take a stand. When you read the story of Daniel in the lion's den, right? They tricked the king to make this decree that nobody could worship anybody but him, and da da da. And the Bible says that Daniel went up in his window and he prayed, as he always did. His life permeated serving and trusting God. And you see the effects of it. Our lives, our masculinity, we should be the same way. When somebody sees us doing something, it should be, when we are reading, when they talk about us reading our Bible, when they talk about us praying, when they talk about us serving, when they talk about as we always did, it should be just part of who we are. That was part of who Daniel was, to serve God, to consistently serve God. And even, and again, you see him go through a hard time. You see him, he ended up in the lion's den, right? Terrifying. You see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, not bowing down to the to the God. That whole book permeates. I'm going to take a stand for who God is, and God is going to take care of me. And when we as leaders, and come back to, us as husbands, us as fathers, us as, we talked about the identity, but understanding that we will serve God no matter what. When times gets hard, when finances are slacking, when our church hurts us, when our marriage isn't exactly where it needs to be, when our children are wayward, whatever it is, we're going to serve God. We lose a job, our boss is a jerk, right? Just the list goes on. Everybody who's going to listen to this understands, the hardships of life, right? If you've lived any length of time at all, you understand that there are hardships. And so to understand that no matter what, we're going to serve God. And then I'm going to jump to the New Testament. And we're going to talk about Peter. And I love Peter because, well, first off, Peter's probably my favorite character in the Bible because he gives me hope. And that's what I tell everybody. I don't know if you've ever watched The Chosen or not. I like the way that they depicted Peter in that series. It's just this really, kind of scrappy guy, really high strung, that's kind of the way that I envision Peter being, very opinionated. We knew he had anger issues. We knew, he was very vocal, about what he stood up for, and then when Jesus was dying on the cross and Peter denied him, when Jesus rose from the dead and Mary was there, Mary come and see him, and Jesus go tell the disciples and Peter. And I think that's something that is so powerful, that basically the last disciple that he's seen, Peter, denying him. And I can only imagine the guilt and the shame that Peter dealt with at that moment. Right? I tell everybody there were two people who turned their back on Jesus at his crucifixion. We know Judas and Peter. And how you handle that, right? How you handle your failure is important. But Jesus shows us something very important there, that as a father, as a husband, you have to give yourself room to fail. Because you're going to do it. You're going to fail. We're human. We're not Jesus. And then we see Peter in Acts, the book of Acts, and you see the power in which, Peter preached the first, gospel sermon. 3,000 people come to know Jesus, in Acts chapter 2. And then you see him, you see him in Acts chapter 4, and and he's healing people. His very shadows healing people, and all this stuff. And they're telling them never to preach about Jesus, and they're rejoicing and being filled with the Holy Spirit. In his failure, when we talk about Peter, the vast majority of people, when they think about Peter, is the rooster crowing. That was just one of his failures, and he had many. Right? You can go to the book of Galatians and see him fail again. Right? Where Paul had to call him out. Even in spite of his failures, God used him as the cornerstone of the church. Knowing all of this stuff was going to take place. In spite of his failures, God still used him. And as a man, as a husband, as a father, as a leader, as, in your community, and, maybe you're on, pastor's council, maybe you're on, school board, maybe you're on city council, whatever, you are going to fail at some point. And it's okay. I come back to my favorite quote: you never take a loss, only a lesson. When you do fail, you can't freak out. You failed, you get up, you dust off your knees, and you learn from it.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. That's a really good way of answering that. I wanted to just switch gears because not only did you write this wonderful book, you and your buddy Kyler run a really good podcast. And I wanted to just switch gears and talk about your podcast, Real Men Talk, And specifically, I wanted to hone in on, I was listening to several episodes. It was just take some time and really listen to your guys's, what you two have to offer. And the one that got me really listening to what you guys had to say was episode 106, and that's the entertainment of sin and how strongholds are created. And I'd like you to just talk about this episode, the stuff that you guys went into in this, and how important it is for men to understand how it is that entertaining sin, letting sin in, and how it creates these strongholds in our lives and how that works.
Yes. Well, thank you for the question, first and foremost. Going into we live in a culture, and I keep coming back to that because culture permeates everything, right? It's where we live, right? That sin is so normalized. And when it's normalized, it's accepted, even inside the church at times. You look inside the church, and some sins are more acceptable than others, right? Somebody who is, somebody who comes in and gossips, nobody really cares about, but, let somebody come in who has a child that is, homosexual, and everybody freaks out, right? Or is, something like that, and it's like, hey, wait a minute, sin is sin across the board. And in this culture where sin is accepted, we have to be the difference, right? We have to stand against um, the culture. Really, we have to take a stand. Um, we have to recognize sin. I want to go back to um, where sin comes from, right? Going back to 2 Corinthians 10:4 and 5, bringing every thought underneath the captivity of Jesus Christ. And that's probably my favorite verse in the entire Bible because it teaches me how to fight spiritually. Um, because everything that you will do, everything will start with a thought, good or bad, it doesn't matter. Um, Sin, you know, new ministry ideas, it all starts with a thought, and understanding that not every thought that you have is your own, right? You know, if you've ever, if you or your listeners have ever had a thought and you entertain it for just a moment and you're going, wait a minute, where did that even come from? Right? I don't know if you've ever had thoughts like that. I have, and I'm like, where in the world did these come? That this does not belong here, right? You know, how did I get off on this? And yeah, because it wasn't your thought to begin with, right? Satan implants thoughts. The demons implant, spiritual, that is spiritual warfare. And when we entertain that, sin comes about, and it moves from our mind to our hearts, and then it moves from our hearts to action, right? When you see somebody who has um, cheated on their wife, right? That didn't just happen, right? That it's not like it was just a spare of the moment thing, and oh, here we are. No, that there was thoughts there that were entertained that did not belong, and instead of stopping those thoughts, we like those thoughts, right? We enjoy sometimes those thoughts. And that's spiritual warfare. That is in essence the the strongholds that we ourselves create in our spiritual lives, right? Um, and then understanding that the culture, the entertainment, the different forms of we should be very mindful about what we watch. We should be very mindful about what we listen to. I'm not saying that all TV show. I'm not one of these guys that everything you watch has got to be on Angel TV or whatever Chris. That's not what I'm saying, right? I'm a big Marvel guy. Right, exactly. I love Marvel. I like Star Wars. I like Lord of the Rings. All that stuff. And but to understand, I love war movies. I love action movies. But to understand that there are some things that is not profitable for us that we have no business watching. I remember, for example, I was talking to somebody, and honest to God, I didn't really know. Um, they were talking about Game of Thrones. That's what it was. Game of Thrones. And they were talking about how good this show was. They're like, "Oh man, this is good." These are people from church, right? And I'm like, "Oh." I'm like, okay. So I'm at home, and I knew it was an adult show, so my kids weren't. I was off work one day, and so I turned it on. I'm going. It didn't take me long to turn it off, and I was going, oh my goodness, there are some things that we should not watch. That we have to be mindful of those things. There are things that our children should not be watching. There are things that our children should. There are songs that our children should not listen to. Right? I don't care if they're Swifties or not. There's my daughters get mad. I'm like, get that trash out of my house. You know, and they're like, oh, Dad, all the kids at school listen to it. I'm like, I don't care. I don't care. I'm not your friend. I'm your dad. You know, and and so th- allowing that stuff into our house brings things, spiritual things into our house that doesn't belong there. If you were a child of God, it does not belong there. And you're absolutely right when you mention the word discernment. We have to there are things that when we watch our spirits is like don't stop it right now. Um you know and we should stop, we should listen to that, right? And so to understand that, again, I go back to understand that there are things that we shouldn't be listening to. There are things that we shouldn't watch. There are people that we shouldn't be around. There are people that we shouldn't be around by ourselves. There are people that our families don't need to be around, right? And I'm not talking about not sharing the gospel, right? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about completely isolating yourself. I'm talking about there's a difference between witnessing to somebody, communicating with somebody, and hanging around somebody, allowing them to influence you, allowing them to influence your family, right? There's a difference. There are people in our lives sometimes that we have to get rid of. There are things in our lives that we have to get rid of. There are, games, for a long time, I played a lot of Call of Duty. I enjoy Call of Duty, or I did, and until I was so angry all the time that I couldn't hardly stand it, because I suck. And
Yeah, no, I relate. Yeah, there was a game I played all the time just like that, man. My wife says you can't play that game anymore. See, the thing is, and that's exactly what it's targeting. It's targeting this anger and aggression issue. It's just a video game.
yeah, and it just goes to show the way things affect us, you know, and we have to be mindful of those things. We cannot just go through this life and with the entertainment world the way that it is, we cannot just go through life and just hope everything turns out for the best because we go to church, right? Or hope everything turns out for the best because we we um we send our kids to a private school, or we me and my wife's been married for a long time, so you just kind of coast through or whatever. Like, we live in a world where you can't do that. You have to be mindful all the time. There are shows I don't let my daughter watch. There are shows I won't watch, right? But, and there are things that I won't allow in my house. Um, just in general. Why? Because they affect. I do not want those things to influence the people in my house, my children, my wife, our relationship, right? I don't want it to affect us. And so to be mindful of that, and to be mindful that the entertainment business is out to infiltrate you as a whole, right? Even in, like I said, I love more Marvel, movies and different things like that. Here lately, it's been absolutely crazy.
Right. Right.
And I won't get off on
Right.
this tangent,
Yeah.
but there are things that I'm like, I don't necessarily want my kids watching this. I don't want them seeing, this type of stuff. I don't want them thinking that these things are okay. I don't want them to. I don't want them to think that homosexuality is normal. I don't want them to think that that's okay. I don't want, I want them to understand. I'm also not completely naive to the point that they don't know, right? And when we do come across it, I want them to be able to ask questions, and me to be able to give biblical answers. And so what's also rooted in this question, I'd like to bring back to, like the schools and stuff, being able to know what your kids are watching, being able to know what they are learning at school, being able to know what they are learning at church, right? And when something comes up, because there will be, like, you can't hide your kids from everything, right? You can't. And you don't want to. You want them to be exposed to some, so you can answer questions, right? You don't want them to think that everybody's bad, right? You don't want them to think, we're in the world but not part of the world, right? Or not of the world. And so when things, when my daughter comes home and she's like, hey, she said, I heard this girl I overheard this girl talking about how she had a girlfriend. Why is this bad? Okay, so let's open up the Bible. Let's see what that is, or they come home, for a long time. Well, not for a long time. I do it all the time. We're in summer break right now, so I don't do it right now because they're not in school, but they come home. I'm like, what did you learn today that you questioned? I ask my kids that all the time, and for a long time, it was like every day they're like, well, I was in science class today and they were talking about the earth being, the evolution, and all this stuff. I'm like, okay, so what does the Bible say? And it allows me, they get to see everybody's view, right? Because they're out there. Everybody has the right to believe whatever they want, but there's only one truth, right? And so to show them truth in spite of everybody else's opinions is important. Well, the entertainment business is the same way. Because you will not be able to protect your kids from everything. We were sitting down, we were watching a movie together. What was the name of that movie? Big Red, or it was something on Disney Plus. It had something, this little girl turned into a fox or something like that. I don't know.
Okay.
We ended up turning it off.
Fair enough.
Right. We ended up turning it off because she had this crush on this girl. And I was like, all right, I said, turn it off. We're right in the middle of the movie. And my daughter's like, what? I'm like, yeah. I said, turn it off. And she's like, why? And so what does the Bible say about it? What does the Bible say about this kind of action? What does the Bible say about, this kind of stuff? Why do I want it turned off? It's not, we lived in an era, and I'm not trying to get off on a soapbox, but I grew up in an era when you weren't allowed to ask questions, right? So, I grew up in an era, if they said something, it was either because our parents said so or the Bible said so, and you weren't allowed to question it at all, right? And I don't think that's healthy. I want my kids to be able to ask questions. I want them to be able to, be like, Dad, why is this a problem? Well, that's a great question. Let's explore it. Let's look at this and see what the Bible has to say about that. Let's see what truth has to say about this, and look at it from that perspective and allow them to explore those questions. God, one of my kids, why is God the only way to heaven? That's a fantastic question. Let's explore this, right? Why is Jesus our only way to heaven? Okay, so let's explore this. Let's look at this. That's a fantastic question, and allowing them to ask questions, and so to bring all this into into a wrap here. The entertainment business, the school, the even sometimes our churches, they're all full of people, right? And I'll exclude the church for a minute. The entertainment business
Right.
and the schools and stuff like that, they are full of people who want to educate your kids in the ways of evil, right? And or maybe and I'm not trying to say that they themselves are evil. They are misled. They are lost, right? They don't know truth, right? Now you have people inside the church that don't know truth, right? 17% of people who sit inside of congregations have got an authentic biblical worldview. So 83% of people don't really even know what they believe most of the time. That's a problem. That's another subject for another time. But to understand that Satan is out to get your children, Satan is out to destroy your marriage. And he will use the entertainment business. He will use the schools. He will use sports. He will use fill in the blank. It doesn't matter. And I'm a big sports guy. I love football. I'm a big Packers fan. All that good stuff. But it can't come again. It can't come in between me and my wife. It can't come in between me and my relationship with Jesus. It can't come in between me and my relationship with my children, right? And so to understand that is important. It's so important, and I can't put enough emphasis on how important it is to just understand that the enemy is out to get you, right? And I'm not talking about living in fear all the time. I don't want it to come across that way. But there's a difference between living in fear and having an understanding of, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I think that, so.
No, you're 100%. No, thanks for letting me talk to you about Real Men Talk podcast for a very brief moment there. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. I appreciate you asking about it.
Yeah. So go ahead and tell the audience the name of the book we were talking about. Let's talk about where people can find you and any kind of resources, information, etc., that you would like to plug at the end of the episode here.
Yeah. So, of course, the book, Framework for Biblical Masculinity, you can get a link on our website, www.realmenministries.us, or you can go on Amazon and get it. You either just type in my name, Anthony Curnutt, or Framework for Biblical Masculinity. You can find our podcast on, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Castcom, all that good stuff. And then we're on social media, so you can find us you can connect with Kyler and I on Facebook. You can connect with us on TikTok. You can connect with us on Instagram, all those good things. We would love to hear from you. If you enjoyed our conversation here, or if I'm a big guy that I like, if you don't agree with me, I'd love to hear from you. I love those kind of conversations, to have with people and stuff. And so, we'd love to hear from you. Go get the book, buy a couple of them, give them to your buddies, and stuff like that. And I say that not because I'm just trying to, promote my book, but I believe that the Lord gave me something to say, and I believe that it's for today, it's for the men of today, and I hope that it is blessing men everywhere.
Anthony, I appreciate your time, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, BT, I appreciate you, and I appreciate this opportunity. It was a fantastic conversation, man. I appreciate you.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.